Thank you very much to Vidik for inviting me, and thank you for having me on the panel. Uh, I'll try to answer the two questions in a precise manner. As you mentioned, I left Kenya because I was born in Somalia, but my family moved to Kenya when I was 3 years old.
Oh, okay.
And I grew up in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. That's where I went to school. That's where I was educated together with
Okay.
my younger brother.
Mhm.
And I grew up in a very middle class neighborhood and a very middle class family, went to some of the best schools in Kenya. But then when I was 5 years old, I discovered I was different.
You decided, or you
I
felt
discovered.
you discovered. Okay.
Uh, During recess breaks, I would play with girls instead of boys, and then
Mhm.
the teacher called my mom to bring it up, and my
Mhm.
mom brought it up to me, and that's the first time I knew it was a problem.
Mhm.
And basically, I grew up in a very boxed up environment whereby I knew it was a problem. I couldn't even share my feelings with the closest person to me, who was my mom. And I basically had to leave in fear and go back into myself. But then I was fed up of living such a life because I wanted to live in my truth and I wanted to live my authentic life. And that's why I decided to live in 2012, not for economic reasons, basically based on my gender identity. And I wanted to go to the free world, to Europe, to where I could be myself, to where I would live my honest truth. But then coming from a failed state, it's not easy for us to get visas to come to Europe. So I had to undergo a very difficult journey to be able to access protection. And this is a question that I had to grapple with growing up and even undertaking the journey. I come from a failed state. Am I a failed individual because I come from a failed state? What's the difference between me and the other youngster from Austria, from Australia, from Canada? And it's a question that I always ask myself. And in very difficult journey, 9 months.
But you had which nationality? Kenyan?
No, Somali.
Oh, Somali.
Yes.
Okay.
Through all those years, we were refugees in Kenya, but you never get citizenship
Oh, yeah.
because of the Kenyan laws.
Yes, something
And
we should know too. People are not aware of that.
so you're a refugee for the
Yeah.
rest of your life.
Yeah.
And I was fed up of that as well. But it was a very difficult journey. 9 months from Kenya, Uganda, South Sudan, North Sudan, the Sahara Desert, and finally I made it to Libya, where I was stuck for 7 months of the 9 months, trying to cross and then being caught, taken back to detention, paying or escaping, and then it was a cycle that I underwent for 7 months. And then I finally arrived in Malta in November 2012, where I was detained again in an EU country where laws are supposed to be respected and international law is supposed to be upheld, whereby a refugee has the right under the Geneva Convention of 1951, which was very much a European process at the time after the Second World War, and a refugee has the right to arrive in any country and apply for asylum. But then we were imprisoned, and we applied for protection in prison, something that the European Human Rights Court has found illegal, happening in an EU country. And then basically that's when the reality hit me that okay, I was now in a place whereby my gender identity was going to be accepted, but I would face racism and discrimination and xenophobia on a daily basis. And when I was leaving Kenya, my dream was to go to Sweden because I've always had this dream of getting married to a blonde-haired guy with blue eyes. And I was like, but when I came to Malta, I was detained, and then I found out about the Dublin regulation, and I had friends who had gone to Sweden from Malta or to Austria or to all of these other European countries, and then 1 year, 2 years later, they were picked up by police like a bag of rotten potato and dropped at Malta airport with nothing. And I was like, okay, I left my home, I left my mom, I left my loved ones because I wanted to live my authentic self. Do I want to find myself in this sad, pathetic statistic whereby I am considered a burden, I'm considered disgusting, I'm considered something that states can just throw around from one place to the other? And I was like, listen, I'm not going to get caught up in this disgusting statistic, and I looked at myself in the mirror and I said, girl, you better wake up and start working and branding yourself. It's very unfortunate that we have to look at ourselves as brands, but that's what Europe and the world wants us to do. And I was like, okay, I'm going to play their game. I'm very talented in writing. I've been writing since I was 7 years old. It was the platform that I used to vent and to explore my emotions. And I was like, okay, I'm going to use my writing. I'm going to create a name for myself. And then 4 years or a few years down the line, once I'm very successful, I can move to any country and show them what I've done, my track record, and be like, okay, this is my track record. And this country is not willing to work with me to be very successful. What are you willing to do for me? So that changes the bargaining chip. And that's how my blogging started, and I got a blog with one of the largest newspapers in Malta, and my blog was very much criticized by the locals. Oh, now you're giving the refugees a platform to work for the largest newspaper. Well, we have a lot of Maltese students who are from university and are jobless. And I was like, yes, I'm grabbing that, and please watch the list. This is the first thing that I'm doing. And then 4 years down the line, I have traveled the world. I have spoken at the European Commission, the European Council, the Council of Europe, the United Nations in New York and in Geneva. I was awarded the Queen's Young Leaders in London by the Queen of England this year for my humanitarian work. I have written a book that has launched in 11 countries and done so much amazing stuff just to prove to Europeans, and that is what I tell refugees on a daily basis, that Europeans are very, very busy being Europeans. So until you wake up and you start branding yourself, and you start, when a refugee woman comes to me crying because she has been discriminated against, I'm like, girl, what are you good at? Tailoring. Please start making dresses so that you become a famous designer and countries will want you. And it's very sad that we have to turn again ourselves into brands, but that is what countries have forced us to do. And today I am no longer the silent voice. I am empowered, I am working, I'm taking care of myself, I'm taking care of my community. Refugees in Malta are doing amazing things. I have traveled all over the world, and I'm very much blessed even to have my book being reviewed by the Huffington Post, by the New Internationalist, by the New York Times. And I'm like, now I have the power to decide and to take back my destiny into my own hands. And it's a very sad statistic that countries have positive images of what refugees can do, but yet even in Austria, I would never in a gazillion years come to Austria with all its disgusting policies when it comes to migration and the far right that it's taking. And it has Weris Dirie, one of the most beautiful Somali supermodels that has ever existed, on the cover of Vogue and stuff, who is Somali Austrian. So we have that image, but then Austria still decides to take this disgusting course when it comes to migration and the far right. And the first time that I ever came to Austria was in June of this year, and I met with some Somali refugees here who are living deplorably. Somebody has been here for 15 years, the children have Austrian citizenship, and he was basically told, go back to your country. So that is what I tell refugees, please work very hard. I'm moving now from Malta to Iceland in November, because I'm like, girl, it's time to go. It's a cycle, and I love proving Europeans and even my Somali community and even the transphobes and the homophobes, I love proving them wrong. I've been trying to meet, for example, a very good story. I was trying to meet the Maltese Prime Minister for 3 years. My blog is very successful on the island, and he basically didn't want to meet to discuss his stand on migration. And this year I was speaking, in May I was speaking at the World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul in Turkey. The G8 leaders were in the audience, and Ban Ki-moon, and I was opening the conference, and I didn't know that the less than smart man, because I refused to use a beautiful word like stupid on him. He was in the audience, and he told his secretary, go and grab her after I finished my speech. And he was like, oh, when you go back to, and then I said, she was like, oh, Farah, the Prime Minister wants to speak. Which Prime Minister? The Maltese Prime Minister. And then I was like, ugh. Okay, he wants to speak to me today because I'm in front of the world stage. criticizing his stupid policies. Uh, Let me go and entertain his foolishness in my Kardashian collection dress. At least I'll just give him 5 minutes of my time, waste it. And then I went and he was like, when you go back to Malta, can you please come and speak to us? And I was like, excuse me, sir, I am moving to Iceland, so whatever you have to say it to the other refugees. Like, I have nothing to say to you. And that is what all refugees should do, even in Austria. Please brand yourself and start moving. If Austria is not ready to work with you and to give you the bargaining chip, start packing and show up in fabulous clothes. That's what I'm doing in Iceland this November. Versace all the way. Show up and tell them, listen, I am here. What are you going to do for me? Please, moving on.
So this is very interesting, but just let me ask you a question before you answer the other ones. Are you aware that when you are leaving your country to go and settle into another country without money, actually, if you're not Rockefeller or somebody like that, you are a regular person, are you aware of the fact that it's always difficult to settle in a new country, and that I guess an Austrian going to, a regular Austrian going to Australia or to China would have difficulties coping with the situation. My question is, do you accept the fact that moving to other countries, being a migrant, leaving everything to go to places, has let's say, a particular, a typical, an inherent difficulty, and that is not maybe only European doing that. When you go to other countries, like being an African going to another country in Africa, just being a migrant is an issue. Do you agree to that?
Of course.
Yeah.
When I arrived in Malta, I left, and that's why I don't like the economic migration labeling that's just automatically put on refugees by the far right in Europe, that they're coming to take our jobs, that they're coming to take our houses, that they're coming to take our country. When I was leaving Kenya, I grew up in a very middle-class family. I never lacked for anything. And I left all of that to pursue my happiness and to pursue my freedoms. And then when I showed up in Malta, I didn't even have shoes. Literally, I didn't have shoes. I was walking around without shoes for 5 days. And I've worked every single job in the world to be able to provide for myself so that I'm not labeled a burden. And that's what angers me even more sometimes when I'm speaking in advocacy settings, because I've paid taxes from the first day I arrived there. I've worked my way to the top. I paid for everything, but we are still labeled and maybe I'm different because I'm a huge believer in dreams. Like, nobody is going to tell me what to be and what not to be. That's how my mom brought me up. And that's maybe why I am successful, because I refuse to fit into a box, whether economically, whether physically, whether gender-wise. It's difficult. Even moving to Iceland, I'm leaving everything that I've built in Malta for the last 4 years because of racism, because of xenophobia. I refuse to find myself in a society whereby I've left because of transphobia, and now I'm in a society which is very racist and xenophobic. And I'm leaving. I am saying, like, Versace and that stuff, yes, because I've worked very hard over the last 4 years, but it's still moving, it's still living, I'm still a migrant.
Do you think there are countries which are less xenophobic in the world? I don't know, some dreamland somewhere? A dreamland?
There is no dreamland, but for example, let me tell you why I came to an Icelandic conclusion. This is a country of 300,000 people, and last year 50,000 people signed a petition urging their government to bring in more refugees. This is a country with the first lesbian prime minister in 2009 in the world. So it's a country, I want to be in a country whereby I am going to be judged by the contents of my character, but not who I am. And that's what they did in their 2009 elections. They were like, we don't care who you sleep with at the end of the night. What are you doing for us as Icelanders? And that is where I want to find myself. Not in Austria, whereby you are judged by your skin color. Not in Malta, whereby you are judged by your skin color and your immigration background. I want to find myself in a situation whereby I'm going to be judged. And Iceland, for example, that's a good example.
Okay,
example.
that's a point. And now, what is your nationality right now? Do you have still
I'm still a refugee,
okay?
and that's something else. Even in Malta, like refugees will never means never. My book is called Never Arrive. Refugees in Malta will never become citizens, never. And I don't want to be 70-year-old still going through the the foolishness of going through immigration. And I had an experience in Copenhagen in this year. I was flying in from Istanbul to Copenhagen, and I have European residency. And then when I showed up at the immigration desk, this blonde-haired, blue-eyed lady, clearly very backward in terms of her thinking of refugees. She was like, "Where are you coming from, madam?" I said, "Istanbul. Originally Malta. I have my residence card. What are you coming to do in Copenhagen?" And then she asked me 25 stupid questions while other people were just passing through. And then by the time I entertained her nonsense and answered all the questions like rightfully, so that I don't, because they end up pressing your buttons so that once you explode, you look like the angry black woman who has caused chaos at the airport. And at the end of the situation, I was like, "Bye, Felicia." And clearly white, she was like, "What is Felicia?" She said, "My name is not Felicia." And then I said, "I know, dearie. Felicia means the B word. So bye, B." And by the time she was picking up her jaw from the ground, I was already out of the terminal.
That's very provocative.
Please.
Just a question too, but because the subject is about migrants going to Europe and etc. In your case, as a transgender, even though you went through all kind of difficulties and predicaments, don't you consider it's still better to be in Europe than, let's say, in Kenya or Uganda?
I do, and trust me, I don't take my blessings for granted. For example, in Malta has one of the best gender identity laws in the world. You can just change your gender identity on your passport based on self-determination, and that's something that Austria even doesn't have. And I don't take my blessings for granted. But at the end of the day, there's something called intersectionality, and intersectionality means different identities within one identity. So, for example, there's this paragraph on my book whereby I explain about that question, and it goes deeper into intersectionality. And the paragraph reads, right, it is very shortly. "I have been told many times by family, friends, colleagues, and strangers that I, a black African Muslim refugee trans woman, that I'm outside the norms accepted by society, that my dreams are a reflection of my upbringing in a dissident, amoral society that has corrupted who I really am." But who am I really? Am I allowed to speak for myself, or must my desires form the battleground for causes I don't care about? My answer to that is very, very simple. No one, and I repeat, no one, should presume to have the authority to allow anyone anything. By reflecting on this notion, I discovered that only I could give myself permission on how to lead my life. Naysayers, be damned. In the end, something gives way. The earth does not move, but something shifts. That shift is change. And what is change precisely? Change, according to me, is the layman's lingo for that elusive state that lovers, dreamers, prophets, and politicians call freedom. So, freedom for me means a package. It doesn't mean one part of the package. So for me to be freely trans in Europe, and I'm basically discriminated against based on my skin color on a daily basis, and for me sometimes racial discrimination on the street is different to structural discrimination, because you can deal with stupidity on the streets, but when you walk into an office and the structures are very racist and built on racism, that's something that I can't take. I'm sorry, but I can't.
So, do you think you are a typical refugee? You are not.
I'm a blessed refugee, because not every refugee gets to meet the Queen. Not every refugee travels the world. I am very blessed, and I'm very aware every day when I wake up, and sometimes even in Malta. And today I was having a press junket whereby we were meeting with several, and they ask you, "Aren't you blessed to be in Europe?" And I'm like, "No, because I worked for everything." And this is a question that even within my Somali community they don't like it, because you are supposed to be blessed and humble because you have been handed something, because a woman woman is supposed to be thankful always for the small things that she has. And I'm like, no, I worked for everything.
And what is your
Everything.
link, what is your relationship to religion? Last question, because we are interested in having a real person, a case study, sort of.
Uh, I grew up in Islam. I'm still a Muslim. I dealing with all the emotions. I was very angry at God. I was like, and I've not started even my physical transition. Yes, whenever I go, but if I ever go back to Africa, people are like, she's very beautiful, and then when they found out the trans identity, they're like, yes. So God is, all of this is God. I've not started my physical transition, and at the end of the day, I was very angry. I was like, you created my like this. You gave me Kardashian curves. I didn't go to the shop and buy them. I don't have millions to buy a butt like Kim, and you gave me one naturally. Why did you create me like this? Why wasn't I just born normal? And I had to go through therapy upon my arrival in Malta and write and self-reflect to understand that God has created me in the most beautiful sense, and people like me, it's just society's interpretation of religion that's based on their norms that has dictated over the years. So now my relationship with the higher being, whatever it is